All right, my name's Erik Conway, and I guess I'm here to give you and explain to you one reason why what Kevin just told you we're not likely to do, we're very, very unlikely to do. And so I will be an even more depressing person than Kevin. I think he might even have more hope than I do. A couple of caveats. Goodney introduced me at the beginning of this as the historian of the Jet Propulsion Lab, and while that's true, I am not here as a representative of JPL or Caltech. I have to do this work, and I have always done my work on Merchants of Doubt independently of them, so I am here on vacation to give you this message of sun and light. Second, he's mentioned the Merchants of Doubt movie. Who saw it in the screening? Okay, so a bunch of you. Fortunately, the book is actually quite different than the movie. So you're going to get something that's out of this that's quite a bit different. And the movie's not actually out yet commercially. It actually comes out this coming Friday in the United States. I'd like to be able to tell you when it will get to Europe, but I have no idea. I have release dates through like April in the US and not anything overseas. So, Merchants of Doubt, how climate science became a victim of the Cold War. How a small group of scientists exploited scientific uncertainty and promoted doubt about a set of environmental issues. That's a book Naomi and I published in 2010. More recently, we have published a book called, a much shorter book called The Collapse of Western Civilization, in which we make Kevin's point for him, although we had not met him yet. And we talk about this problem of scientists consistently under-predicting climate change and other things. So perhaps I should have been asked to tell that story instead, but I wasn't. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is established in 1992 by the Republican, and in the United States, the Republican President George H.W. Bush, who called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. The Framework Convention was a response to scientific warnings and evidence that went well back into the 19th century. In 1900s, Monty and Arrhenius suggested that increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from fossil fuels could warm the Earth. He did this by laboriously hand calculating the consequences of CO2 emissions at each 10-degree latitude line for the northern hemisphere. Calculating the effect of doubling the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, he found what has often been the canonical Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change rule of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius, although he got the right answer for the wrong reasons. And he was also a Swede. Like probably many people here, at least me yesterday, thought that global warming would be a good thing. And there kind of the issue ended for many decades. There was a strong pushback to what Arrhenius had written by folks who believed that fundamentally the humans could not emit enough carbon dioxide from early industrialization to change the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And until that amounts of carbon dioxide could be measured quite accurately, no one could prove that pushback wrong. The first person who did was this gentleman, who was not in any way, shape, or form a climate scientist. He was a steam engineer by the name of Guy Callender. There's a wonderful recent biography by Jim Fleming, whose more recent book is on a history of geoengineering, who argued that the increase in CO2 was already happening and measurable. And he believed that temperature was already increasing too from limited amounts of data as available to him in Britain. And there, again, the issue dies for a number of decades. In this case, most likely probably because of the Second World War, which wrapped up most of the scientific community for a good 10 to 15 years. And it doesn't come back again in the United States, at least, until the late 1950s in a debate between these two gentlemen, Hans Suess and Roger Revelle, both of whom worked for the same institution, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California. Their debate was this same one I mentioned earlier in the pushback to Arrhenius, whether the Earth's ecosystems, biospheres, geospheres, absorbed all or only most of the Earth's human emissions of carbon dioxide. The more radical of them thought that there was a slow increase going on, and that if you could go take a set of very accurate measurements and then go back to the same place 10 years later and measure again, you might detect an increase, and the other was no. They wrote a paper in which they made this now famous statement that mankind was performing a great geophysical experiment on the world, managed to get grant funding from the International Geophysical Year to set up this measurement they wanted to make, again expecting to get some other grant 10 years in the future to try again. They hired this gentleman who was just finishing a postdoc at the California Institute of Technology, who had developed a very highly accurate spectrometer to make carbon dioxide measurements with, and shipped him off to the top of a volcano in Hawaii to make 18 months worth of carbon dioxide measurements to produce that baseline so they go back 10 years later and find out whether there had been a change. And you can sort of vaguely see, and unfortunately the quality of this is not good enough to really clearly see, what becomes the famous Keeling curve that is the result, which showing your respiration in the northern hemisphere and these small annual variations, as well as the larger scale increases in carbon dioxide, because it turned out both the gentlemen who wrote this proposal were wrong. Keeling was able to measure the increase in carbon dioxide not in 10 years, but in just that 18 months. That caused a little bit of consternation, but not much. It caused Ravel to put together, or rather as host of a panel, to put together a discussion of this environmental pollution problem from carbon dioxide. And they states here that by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in the atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. This is a publication of an organization that was then known as the President's Science Advisory Committee. It was a group of mostly very famous nuclear physicists, and it is the first definable statement from a major Washington policy organization that climate change would most likely occur. It informed a message that was put into President Lyndon Johnson's special message to Congress on environmental pollution by a speechwriter by the name of Bill Moyers, who's still around and has become very famous as a television personality in the country, that this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Note, this is 1965, the glorious year in which I was born. It's not new. And here is a better indication of Keeling's chart, kind of ending off up here. Nothing much is done again. Lyndon Johnson probably had no idea of the real implications of what he was saying. One of his major campaign funders was an oil services company. And of course, he had been a senior senator from the state of Texas, which is the heart of the oil industry in America. The issue doesn't disappear this time, at least not in the scientific community within the United States. There are a number of subsequent analyses done by various groups in the states to try to figure out what the implications of increasing carbon dioxide would be. There's one in 1975 that tries to figure out the problem of whether carbon dioxide increasing would overwhelm the aerosol-based cooling that one segment of the American community expected and couldn't iron out. And that report concludes that you should give us more money for research. Also a constant refrain in climate change discussions. This one in 1979 is famous as the Charney Report in the United States, stating that a plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's consumption of fossil fuel and changes in land use. That actually was initially commissioned as a review of another report that was classified for a while by a group called the Jasons in the United States. The Jasons were, again, a bunch of mostly nuclear physicists who took on special tasks from the US Department of Defense. In 1977, they assigned themselves the task of figuring out this carbon dioxide problem to the extent that they made their own little climate model to try to parse it out. And their report caused consternation when it arrives in 1979 in the Carter White House, because the Carter administration had chosen to commit to replacing oil as the principal fuel for American electricity consumption with domestically produced coal as a response to the Arab oil crisis of the 1970s. And they did not like one bit the implications of this message. So, this climate concern is not new to the scientific community. It's been going on my entire life. But opinion polls show that many of my fellow citizens have not listened or have not heard. Polls consistently show that there's about a third of the population in the United States that doesn't believe there is any evidence of global warming. It varies. These numbers change every year, but between a third and a half believe that warming is mostly caused by human activities. It's actually right now sitting around 49%. Views are strongly polarized politically, with Republicans and more likely to reject the scientists' position than Democrats. So why is this? What happened? How is it the American scientific community can achieve a universal consensus while the general population does not know that consilience exists? And therefore, why didn't we take steps to protect the planet? At the same time, the scientific understanding is coalescing, and the Intergovernmental Panel is being established, on climate change is being established in 1988-1999 timeframe, and the National Energy Policy Act was being written. There is a politically motivated campaign started up to cast doubt upon the science and upon the scientific community as a means of preventing policy action. One of the most important organizations for a long period of time, going back to the late 80s, is a small institution known as the George C. Marshall Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Here's a statement of one of the folks who was affiliated with them for quite a while, a Canadian climatologist by the name of Tim Ball, arguing that the widely propagated fact that humans are contributing to global warming is the greatest deception in the history of science. Where did the Marshall Institute come from? It's the work of these three gentlemen. Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist who is the founder of the organization that Gavin Schmidt now works for and is director of. You're the third director, right? Gavin's the third director. One of the ironies of our story that I probably won't bring up again is that Robert Jastrow hired James Hansen, who is the famous climate scientist who's been arrested in the White House protesting about our inaction for climate science. And of course, Hansen hired Gavin Schmidt. Frederick Seitz, president of the National Academy of Sciences. He was not an astrophysicist, he was a solid-state physicist, and he was extremely prominent. In addition to being a president of the National Academy of Sciences in the 1960s, he became president of Rockefeller University, and he was a consultant to R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. You should all be asking yourselves, why is a solid-state physicist working for a tobacco company? And the third, William Nierenberg, nuclear physicist and director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who you saw before with Roger Revelle. They are a seminal institution in American science, and for all these reasons, these gentlemen are the founders of the Marshall Institute. What brought them together, though, was not climate change at all. It was President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. These three gentlemen were all Cold Warriors. They believed in the Soviet Union must be defeated by the United States. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative came under attack by other scientists in the early 1980s, the leaders of the attack were the astronomer Carl Sagan and the nuclear physicist Hans Bethe. They responded by founding the Marshall Institute to defend the Strategic Defense Initiative. Here is one of the letters that Jastrow wrote to Bill Nierenberg here in 1984, explaining what the Marshall Institute was to do. It was not to be a scientific think tank. It was not to do scientific research. Rather, it would support the Strategic Defense Initiative, other issues related to national security, by countering attention that left-leaning academics were getting in the media. Notice that their job was not to do science, but to create controversy in the mass media by focusing their efforts on media outreach. What's going on here? The Strategic Defense Initiative was a departure from the long-established doctrine of mutual assured destruction. Anyone who's much younger than me has maybe never heard of this. The idea was that the Soviet Union and the United States were essentially holding each other hostage. If one of them launched their ballistic missiles at the other side, the other one would launch before they hit. Both sides would die, and along with most of the rest of the world. Okay? That was our strategy, our nuclear strategy for 30-something years. All right? And what Reagan wanted to do was build this space-based defense system that would shoot down the Soviet ballistic missiles, a missile shield, he called it. Most American scientists believed that this wasn't feasible with the technology at the time. I would argue it's not feasible now either. And if it were feasible, it would be destabilizing. In other words, it would cause the Soviet Union to risk the starting of a nuclear war because Star Wars existed. That's what it means to be destabilizing. About 650 scientists and engineers signed 6,500, excuse me, scientists and engineers signed a petition circulated by Sagan and Beta declaring a boycott of the program's funds. And Sagan, in fact, debated and the head of the Ballistic Missile Defense Agency in public and at this time frame in order to generate media attention against SDI. Contra the vast majority of their colleagues, though, Castro and Seitz and Ehrenberg believed that SDI was not only feasible, it was necessary, and its construction was urgent. They spent 5 years working to defend SDI by promoting an alarming view of Soviet strength and a frightening view of American weakness. This was a clear and focused strategy. If the media did not give their view equal time, they would threaten to sue under what was known as the Fairness Doctrine in the United States, which, by the way, no longer exists. They pursued this not in the halls of science, not in the scientific journals, but in the mass media. So, for example, in 1986, PBS planned to air a show on SDI. The public broadcasting system is what that is in the States, sorry. That Castro considered one-sided, so he sent letters to every public TV station in the United States threatening lawsuits if the program was aired. And here's what he said: they could incur obligations under the Fairness Doctrine to provide airtime for presentation of contrasting views. Most stations didn't air it. One of my favorite documents from this research project still is this article that Castro published in National Review in 1987, thundering that America had 5 years left before the Soviet Union became so powerful it would be able to conquer Europe without firing a shot. And they would be able to force us to negotiate the terms of our surrender. That, of course, didn't happen. Instead, the Soviet Union's vast superiority vanished like a bad dream in the morning between 1989 and 1991, leaving a small set of weak, small, and unstable successor states. We're only beginning to see the revival of a much stronger core of Russia. So they could have retired, but they didn't. After all, our scientists won. Cold War over, done. They could have played golf for the rest of their lives. During this time, same time, right, Fred Seitz was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Corporation. The principal strategy, for those of you who saw the Merchants of Doubt movie, or the tobacco industry, was to defend its project by doubt mongering, to insist that the science was too unsettled to take policy action, and therefore it was premature to act to control tobacco use. In 1989, these two threads of the story emerged. This Cold War's over, Soviet Union's disappearing. What did they do? They found a new enemy: environmental extremists. People who exaggerated environmental threats who had a left-wing agenda. They applied the tobacco strategy to insist that the science was unsettled. Doubt is our product, ran the famous 1969 industry memo, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. The Marshall Institute scientists supplied it. While the Marshall Institute didn't directly involve itself in the tobacco story, they did involve themselves with acid rain, with ozone depletion, and with human anthropogenic climate change. They denied the severity of all these problems, in every case insisting that the science is too unsettled to act. How they did it, you'll have to read the book or watch the movie, which one of the nice things about film is that you can do things on film that it's much harder to do in a book. You can show these people talking, appearing on TV, and so forth. Robbie Kenner did a really nice job with our material, plus his own. Why they did it is the story I want to tell you. They didn't do it for money. The story is more complicated than that. They were market fundamentalists. If you remember, well, then again, many of you weren't born yet, the key sticking point between the US and the Soviet Union was the organization of their economies. The Soviet Union was a centralized, state-owned and run economy, whereas the United States was supposed to be a free market in which most assets, most means of productions, etc., are privately held and privately operated. That's what it means to be a free market. And while the United States has never been a purely free market enterprise country, we subsidize, for example, fossil fuel production and have forever, practically. The reality is that our actors believed fundamentally, deeply, powerfully in the importance of free markets to a free society. This doctrine is known in economic circles as neoliberalism. It's focused on deregulation and releasing the magic of the marketplace. It came to prominence in the early 1980s in both Britain and the United States, but continues and remains dominant through this day in the United States. But the intellectual roots are much earlier than the 1980s. The founder of the movement for neoliberalism is an Austrian by the name of Friedrich Hayek, who formed a secret society known as the Pellerin Society towards the end of the Second World War to promote the undoing of the social welfare states of Europe and what existed in the United States. And his most famous American follower is Milton Friedman, who published a book called Capitalism and Friedman in 1962, making clear the association, the important association in their minds between free markets and political freedom. Civic freedom and free markets are inextricably linked. To control markets, states have to control people, and without free markets, we're on the slippery slope to tyranny. Our contrarians took this argument one step further, that environmentalism represented that slippery slope to socialism because environmental ills generally can only be remedied by some form of government regulation. And from regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it's only a small step towards government control more generally. This idea is articulated in the writings of several of these gentlemen, but most clearly by a fourth scientist I haven't mentioned yet, who was only briefly associated with the Marshall Institute. He actually served in government in the Reagan administration, but in the Department of Transportation briefly, and then he went and set up his own policy shop. That's S. Fred Singer, yet another Cold War physicist, in this case a cosmic ray specialist, and yes, a rocket scientist, is fair to say. He worked with the Rocket and Satellite Research Panel in the 1950s to figure out how to put instruments into rockets, sounding rockets for meteorological, cosmic ray research, and so on. He is also the last survivor of that panel, which is also the organization that proposed the first Earth satellite in the International Geophysical Year. Again, like the other gentleman, he was not a nobody. He was a significant scientific personage. And yet, after he retired from university work in the early 1970s, he involved himself in campaigns that challenged the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and ozone depletion, and tobacco. Between 79 and 85, Fred Seitz worked for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. In the 1990s, Fred Singer joined him in the attack on the EPA for secondhand smoke. The EPA had declared secondhand smoke a carcinogen. Secondhand smoke is not the smoke you get from the cigarette, but for the person who gets it next to you. That result was affirmed by the US Surgeon General. An independent expert panel declared that secondhand smoke was responsible for about 3,000 additional adult cancer deaths per year. plus additional cases of bronchitis and pneumonia in children and infants. And they also argued it was implied in what was known as sudden infant death syndrome at the time. The expert panel had assessed evidence from diverse and independent studies. So why would a cosmic ray scientist challenge it? Well, he kind of told us in his writings, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating danger, he wrote, there is essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives. This is in EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke by another think tank known as the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute. And in a book, Introduction Denying the Threat of Climate Change, in, I believe this is 1991, but yep, there it is, 1991, he had this to say about the real motives of environmentalists and climate scientists whose work supported them. He said, more dangerous are those who have a hidden political agenda, most often oriented against business, the free market, and the capitalistic system. Of course, after the collapse of socialism, it's no longer fashionable to argue for state ownership of industrial concerns. The alternative is to control private firms by regulating every step of every manufacturing process. In other words, environmentalists don't want to improve the environment. They simply want to regulate business. His implication that environmental and climate scientists are merely commies in disguise has since echoed through the American society, endlessly promoted by right-wing columnists like George Will and Charles Krauthammer. I'll show you some of that in a bit. By right-wing radio and TV star Rush Limbaugh, by congressmen, by senators. Here's Senator James Inhofe, who sadly just became chairman of the Senate Environment Committee, who declares climate change a hoax, a liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism. Here's Krauthammer. Socialism has, and here you see this refrain. Singer wrote this in 91, and then Krauthammer is still echoing it in 2009. Socialism having failed so spectacularly, the left was adrift until it struck upon a brilliant gambit, metamorphosis from red to green. The cultural elites went straight from the memorial service for socialism to the altar of the environment. So, are environmentalists just watermelons? Reds and green makeup? Well, the US environmental movement actually has a very long and somewhat complicated history. Its origins are in the 1920s. In progressive republicanism, we refer to it as. These are some of its stellar lights. Teddy Roosevelt was an early 20th century president, John D. Rockefeller, Gifford Pinchot, who did a lot of his work for environmental action in California. And that Republican consensus on conservation, that's the word I want to use. Remember, conservation and conservative have the same root, remained fairly widely shared. So during the 1960s, when we begin discussing things like the Wilderness Act of the 1964 that designated millions of acres of land as wilderness to be protected by the state, the law passed the Senate by a vote of 73 to 12, and the House of Representatives said 373 to 1. In the early 1970s, the Environmental Protection Agency was actually created by a Republican president who also signed Clean Air Act, the first one that actually had some teeth, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. In other words, all of the fundamental environmental laws in the United States are on this page, and they were done in the Nixon administration by 1974. Things began to change, though. Nixon began to be vilified by business people who didn't like the implications of his regulations, and that small-scale movement steamrolled, or snowballed really, in the 1970s. So by the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan could run on an anti-environmentalist campaign and gain traction. When scientific evidence began to reveal serious problems not amenable to conventional environmental solutions, the Wilderness Act was a conventional solution of taking land out of production. We had acid rain problem developing in the 1980s, ozone depletion, global warming thing comes up all in this Reagan administration. Well, these are all problems that appeared to demand regulation. And the Reagan administration, which had been elected to deregulate, was stuck trying to find its own way forward or to just ignore it. So, some environmentalists might be socialists. I'm sure some of them are, or were. But not all of them, not by far. Not in American society. And by the way, even if they were, that doesn't mean that the science being done by climate scientists was wrong. What it does mean is that there's a problem with our economic system as we know it. It generates a word that I wish Kevin had used, but he didn't, negative externalities, costs that are not reflected in the market price of a good or service. So what's the market externality causing global warming? Well, we all produce carbon dioxide when we turn, except, well, you guys produce very little here in Iceland because you're mostly geothermal. But us Americans produce a lot of it every time you turn on a light switch or drive our cars or fly anywhere whatsoever. But that emission has not got a price attached to it. So there is no incentive to reduce it. Negative externalities are costs that are not reflected in the market price of a good or service. My damage caused by flying here to talk to you was not priced in the cost of my plane ticket. Now, Lord Stern, you heard a strong critique of just about a half hour or so ago, but I think this conclusion of Stern's actually holds up pretty well, even with Kevin's critique. Climate change, he said, was the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever. Market failures occur whenever a market does not price in a substantial impact. And as I've just explained, our economic system does not price in the impact of carbon dioxide, at least not as it's currently structured. It's a market failure. And that's what unites the diverse stories that our serial contrarians addressed. Acid rain, ozone hole, damage from DDT, health effects of tobacco, global warming are all market failures. And it's the natural sciences that revealed their existence. So the natural sciences, climate science, came under attack from those who resisted the conclusion that the free market had in any way failed. These doubt-mongering campaigns from tobacco to global warming have never been about the quality of science. They're about, in part, about profits. The companies fuel this stuff in order to sustain their profitability, to retain their markets. That's why the tobacco industry invented this strategy, and the fossil fuel industry perpetuates it. But they're also about something more. They're about the proper role of government in our society. Because the results of scientific investigation seem to suggest that government really did need to intervene in the marketplace if public health and the environment were to be effectively protected. The defenders of the free market refused to accept those results, and the enemies of government regulation became the enemies of science. This perspective helps to explain a number of things, Naomi and I think. Why otherwise distinguished scientists would reject the work of their own colleagues. Why a good part of the leadership of the Republican Party of the United States now doubt well-established science. Why a large number of Americans resist this conclusion too. Now, another of the ironies of this story is that there are market-based solutions to environmental pollution. One of these is emissions trading. Nowadays, for climate change, we call it carbon pricing. Kevin says this won't work. It might have worked if we had started 20 years ago, but he's probably right that it's now too late. At least it is if we want to stay anywhere near the 3 or 4 C limit that we haven't even accepted as a limit yet. In the 1990s, when the US instituted emissions trading to control acid rain, acid emissions fell, electricity prices fell, and people in the Midwest, where most of it was generated, did not find themselves with noticeably less liberty than other US citizens, and in fact they still have lower electricity prices than most of us on the coasts. So Milton Friedman's wrong about an inextricable link between economic and political freedom. The slippery slope to socialism argument isn't true. More ironies. While we have delayed acting on global warming, the problem has gotten worse. Many scientists now think we are reaching or have even passed key tipping points. The longer we wait, the more we increase the likelihood that we will need intrusive government action to prevent catastrophe. What Kevin tells us we need to stay within the 2C limits is that everybody, all 330 million people in the United States, have to drastically reduce their energy usage. There's no way that happens if the state doesn't make them. And it's not going to, by the way. I'm darn sure it will. By fostering delay, the merchants of doubt have made it more likely that the very thing they most dreaded, an activist, interventionist government, actually occurs when climate damage becomes more severe. All societies accept some limitations on the actions of others. Without such limits, there is no such thing as civil society. We create those limits based on our judgments of potential risks and harms, and that's why it's important for us to understand climate science, what it tells us about the risks and harms that we face. Conclusions. It's very short. The denial of environmental consequences of the technological society we live in is all about the Cold War-inspired faith in the invisible hand of the marketplace. It echoes even here and now, and it will continue to, in the ascension of neoliberalist deregulation in our societies.